everyone, we're going to continue with the nervous system. In your course pack, this begins on page 107. Now, we're going to cover the topics of ramus, plexus, and reflex arcs. In your textbook, this comes from chapters 12 and 13. To start, we're going to discuss the macroanatomy and microanatomy of a nerve. Macroanatomy are the bigger structures, while microanatomy are the smaller structures. I think you'll find that a lot of these terms are familiar. Back in the muscular system, we talked about the epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, and we talked about basically this same exact setup as you see here. Instead of having the suffix of mysium, this time we see the suffix of neurium. So when we're looking at nerve structure, the epineurium here is the membrane wrapping the outer covering of the nerve. Now if we look inside, there are bundles of neurons, and those bundles are called fascicles. These fascicles are held together by a type of perimysium, or here it's called perineurium. Now if we continue on and look at an individual nerve, each individual nerve is also covered and wrapped by endoneurium. If you were to go inside of that endoneurium, you would then find Schwann cells wrapping and covering and insulating this nerve, if in fact it is white matter. And travel even deeper in, you would then find the axon of that neuron. So imagine if you were piercing through this nerve and your goal was to reach an axon. You would pierce through the epineurium first, the perineurium, which wraps a fascicle, the endoneurium next, the Schwann cell, which covers the axon, and then finally you would reach the axon. That would be the last thing that you would reach as you drove into this cell, perhaps with a needle. So these terms hopefully are just a review for you. This comes from page 107. We discussed something similar back in the muscular system. At the very bottom of your page, let me draw your attention to some nerve names. Now, this is a great helpful clue. When you see a tract, olfactory tract, optic tract for instance, the implication here is that we're talking about the central nervous system. If, however, you see the word nerve or ganglion or ganglia attached to it, then your assumption is that is in the peripheral nervous system. So optic nerve is not in the CNS, it's within the PNS, or dorsal root ganglion tells us, just by the nature of that term, that structure is within the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system. These are excellent clues that you should hang on to as you study through lab content. So let's talk about the structure that you see here. You recall that we've looked at the spinal cord cross-section before, and there are spinal nerve roots that come and go from that spinal cord cross-section. You can see a dorsal root, which carries what type of information to the spinal cord? All right, that's sensory. And we have a ventral root, which carries information away. That happens to be motor in nature. Okay, so you'll notice that when this nerve joins as one, it travels out through the intervertebral foramen, and then once it emerges here, it immediately splits. Now, we know that spinal nerves are mixed nerves, meaning that they contain both motor and sensory neurons housed within their epineurium. Once we emerge from that intervertebral foramen, this set of nerves will branch. And of course, there's a posterior portion that travels to the back side of the body and an anterior portion that travels to the front side of the body. So a ramus is a branch of a spinal nerve. It is different from a root. A root is simply a sensory or a motor component of a nerve. A ramus, however, is a mixed nerve, meaning it carries both motor and sensory information within the epineurium. So when I think of the word ramus or plural rami, I want to think about a branch. Okay, so branch or arm is a way to think of this. Now there's always a piece that stays toward your back, and there's always a piece that travels around to the front side of your body. The posterior or dorsal ramus is the one that remains near your back, and the ventral or anterior ramus is the one that travels around to the front side. So just for fun, let's think about this. The latissimus dorsi is a muscle on the back side. Which ramus would serve it? Well, that would be your dorsal ramus. It would serve your lat muscles on the back side. And of course, the ventral ramus travels to the front, so can you think of a muscle on the anterior trunk that might be served by a ventral ramus? Well, that could be pectoralis major, could be rectus abdominis, so we could pick one of those as an example that would be served by a ventral ramus. Here you can see also the branches of the spinal nerve after they emerge from the intervertebral foramen. You can see again the dorsal ramus that serves the back side of the body, while the ventral ramus travels around to the anterior or front side. So these ventral rami do not give you a hug all the way around. These stop along the midline. So on both sides, left and right, those ventral rami travel to your midline and they stop there along your midline. Here you're looking at what's called a dermatome map. A dermatome map shows us the spinal nerves and how they serve the skin. Derma means skin. So in the pictures here, you'll notice the color coding. The cervical spinal nerves serve the head and the arms area. It's colored green. The thoracic spinal nerves are colored blue, and they serve the chest, the trunk, and a bit of the arms. You'll notice the lumbar spinal nerves are somewhat purple in color. They serve the front of the legs, while the sacral spinal nerves serve the back side of the legs. Now, this is very useful because if, for instance, you have numbness in the back of your legs, then we say, hey, that's probably a sacral spinal nerve, and we can narrow it down to exactly which spinal nerve is causing the problem. For people who have numbness running down the back of their legs, it might in fact be an inflammation of the sciatic nerve, which is a branch off of one of those sacral spinal nerves. Or if you have carpal tunnel syndrome, it matters whether or not you have pain in your thumb area or pain toward your pinky area. That allows us to figure out exactly which spinal nerve is causing the problem. So the dermatome map here is based on those spinal nerves and the region of skin that they serve. Interesting stuff can come from knowing your spinal nerves and their mapping to the skin. We realize that viruses oftentimes inflame our nerves, and they will, of course, show up on the skin surface. This inflammation here that you can see on the bottom is a shingles rash. That's the varicella virus, same one that causes chicken pox. So it's actually nerve inflammation that's appearing here on the skin surface. So if you can tame that nerve inflammation, then that skin rash will go away. You can also see here other types of rashes that come from these viruses like chickenpox or the varicella virus. When these viruses become latent, they actually hang out in the dorsal root ganglion area of your spinal nerves. So they can reactivate later in life, especially if there's changes to your immune system and your immune system is no longer able to keep that virus sedated. Here you can see how the herpes has traveled along a particular spinal nerve. And these viruses will inflame nerves. They'll start at the back, they'll wrap themselves to the front, but they won't cross your midline. In order to hit the other side of your body, that inflammation has to begin at your back and then travel around the opposite side of your body. You can see in these pictures, it seems to be one side of the face that's receiving the inflammation, not both sides, and that's because that's one side of the nerves. Here happens to be cranial nerves that are inflamed from that virus. And really fascinating look here at herpes inflammation. It's inflamed one set of nerves on one half of the tongue. You notice it perfectly stops there along the midline and not affecting the other side. In order to inflame the other side of the tongue, that nerve would have to be inflamed coming from the opposite side. So it's not going to cross the midline because the nerves are not built that way. So let's talk now about a ramus versus a plexus. Earlier, we defined the term ramus as a branch or an arm. So let's remind ourselves and just put that here. Let's now say that a plexus is a network. So you can see here they're showing us lumbar spinal nerves, L1 through L5. Each one of these coming off here is simply a ramus. So this might be a ramus off of the spinal nerve. Now you'll notice that L1 has some branches, right, ramus, that comes down here and actually joins with a portion of L2. and L2 joins down here with L3 and even L4. And so these networks that are created result from branching or rami that intermingle with these other spinal nerves. So you might say, wow, this is a complicated mess, but there's actually a benefit to the way this works. If there's damage to any one of these nerves, the network allows for the body to still function, whether it's sensory or motor information, because both travel inside of these nerves. So when you're thinking about the crisscrossing network that you see in this picture, think about that as a plexus, a network. A ramus is just a single branch of a spinal nerve. So it looks like we're now ready to talk about plexuses over on page 109. And of course, the nerve plexus means it's a network of branching rami. So there's 5 major nerve plexuses that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about the cervical nerve plexus, which is an area of the neck. We'll talk about the brachial plexus, that serves the arms. There's also a lumbar plexus that serves the front of the legs, and the sacral nerve plexus, which serves the back of the legs. Not pictured here is the solar plexus that serves our vital organs in our abdominopelvic and thoracic areas. So let's talk about the cervical nerve plexus first. We know this serves the neck area, and the most important member of this is the phrenic nerve, this one right here. And the phrenic nerve is actually part of the cervical nerve plexus, which is formed of several cervical spinal nerves. The reason the phrenic nerve is important is it travels to the diaphragm. And you may have heard of the diaphragm before. It is involved in breathing. So this particular nerve plexus ultimately innervates or supplies a nerve supply to the diaphragm and allows us to breathe. You know, in the summertime, we often hear about people going into a swimming pool, going for a dive, and unfortunately, it perhaps has been a very shallow pool and they break their neck. And if people are unable to breathe because of breaking this phrenic nerve connection, then they will drown. So drowning may in fact result from this disconnection, you might say, of that phrenic nerve to its diaphragm. Now, interesting that we know that the phrenic nerve does innervate the diaphragm, so if someone has the hiccups, it is an inflammation of that phrenic nerve or other nerves that serve in that area. All right, so cervical nerve plexus, what you want to know is that the phrenic nerve is the major nerve here. It supports nerve supply to the diaphragm, and it allows for us to breathe. Let's next talk about the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus serves the arm all the way down to the hands, and you see it travels here somewhat in the armpit area, and there are 5 major nerves here that we want to pay attention to. One of them is this musculocutaneous nerve, which serves, as you might expect, muscles and skin. There's the median nerve. There's an ulnar nerve, a radial nerve, and those of course serve those bones that we have the names for. And then there's finally an axillary nerve, which is up here in this area. So 5 major nerves in the brachial plexus serve the arm and the hands. And like we were talking earlier, you can see that the coloration here on the hand, the median nerve serves certain fingers, ulnar nerve serves the pinkies, and the radial nerve serves the thumb area. So if you have carpal tunnel from maybe using a computer mouse and not having it ergonomically set up to suit your hand, then you can have pain or numbness around your wrist area, and we can figure out exactly which nerve is entrapped if we can look at a map like this. So what do you want to know? Well, I would know the 5 nerves that belong to this particular plexus, and of course there's an axillary nerve, which is not pictured here. And I would know that that brachial nerve plexus serves the arm and the hand. Interesting here, brachial nerve plexus injury means that this person cannot raise his arm, the left arm there, like he can raise his right arm. Let's talk about the lumbar plexus first. The lumbar plexus serves the front of the leg. The major nerve here is the femoral nerve that runs down the front of the leg. Okay, so you'll want to know that. And the sacral nerve plexus includes the sciatic nerve, big one here, runs down the back of the leg. You'll see that this sciatic nerve runs through this area here, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So the thing to remember is lumbar serves the front of the leg, sacral nerve plexus serves the back or posterior side of the leg. You can see here the lumbar plexus is formed from the lumbar spinal nerves. And exactly as we would expect to see for any plexus, a crisscrossing and networking of those nerves, and that is what allows for us to have a backup plan in case there's injury or problem to any one of these nerves. The sacral nerve plexus we know travels down the posterior side of the leg. The important one to remember there, of course, is sciatic nerve. You can see how it travels through this muscle here. That's hard to read. It's called the Piriformis muscle. That's not one you had to learn this semester. But if that muscle squeezes that sciatic nerve, it can cause inflammation of the sciatic nerve. Here you can see a little better piriformis muscle right there, and the sciatic nerve travels right through there. And again, here you can see these lumbar and spinal nerves actually form part of that lumbar plexus and part of that sacral nerve plexus. There's that sciatic nerve. Sciaticus or sciatic nerve inflammation can result when that piriformis muscle inflames and squeezes that sciatic nerve. So there may be sensations or loss of sensations all the way from the hip, the buttocks, all the way down the back of the leg, as far down as the foot. So somebody may have numbness as far away as the foot. So it's oftentimes we don't think about connecting that nerve inflammation from the foot all the way back up here to where the inflammation may occur in that piriformis muscle. So here you can see how that piriformis muscle can squeeze around that sciatic nerve. All right, it's not a great picture here, but the solar plexus is our last nerve plexus, and it involves two major nerves, the splanchnic nerves and the vagus nerve. So this, what you're looking at here, is actually behind the gut. It's behind the stomach and the intestines. So let's look at a different picture so you can see this vagus nerve here in a little more detail. So the vagus nerve is an unusual cranial nerve. This cranial nerve travels away from the brain. Most cranial nerves serve some part of your face, but this one actually travels down to the heart, the lungs, the stomach, digestive organs, and the kidneys. So you see how far away it travels from the brain. That's where it gets its name from. Vagus means it is the wanderer. So it is one of the major components of the solar plexus, which sits behind the stomach. You know, if someone is punched in the stomach hard enough, they can have their breath knocked out. That's because this vagus nerve can essentially control, respiration, digestive activities. So it's a big component for the parasympathetic nervous system. So we're going to be talking about that one in our next chapter. All right, so switching gears, at the very bottom of page 109, let's take a moment to talk about reflex arcs. Reflex arcs are rapid, predictable, involuntary responses to a stimulus. Normally, they can't be learned, but there are some things that you can learn, such as typing. You don't even have to look at the keyboard screen, right? Some reflexes travel through your brain, other reflexes travel through your spinal cord, and that's what we're going to focus on here. These reflex arcs here are the ones that travel through your spinal cord. So some reflexes do travel through your brain, blinking, for instance. We're not going to be talking about those here today. Reflex arcs always travel in one direction, and that is from the stimulus through a sensory nerve in the dorsal root into the spinal cord and then back out a ventral root. Now, you can see in this picture, we're coming with sensory information into the dorsal root. We travel into the spinal cord, and then we come back out this ventral root, which is motor information. Now, there may or may not be a set of interneurons in the spinal cord's gray matter. Okay, sometimes they're part of the reflex arc, sometimes they're not. A lot of these reflexes are hardwired, so it's not like sometimes the interneuron will be involved and sometimes it won't. It simply depends on the type of reflex arc. Some of them are hardwired to include neurons and interneurons in their pathway, and sometimes they're not. So we're going to talk about the general pathway here. On your worksheet, you'll notice that the general pathway follows it like this. From a sensory neuron, we travel into the dorsal root ganglion. We transmit into the interneurons of the spinal cord, sometimes, not always. And then we exit the spinal cord by going right back out through a motor neuron. Now, you may not need to go up to the brain. Okay, certain things are just reflexed into the spinal cord and right back out. If your brain needs to be notified, then that information will of course travel up to your brain. Otherwise, this reflex arcs will bypass your brain. So that's your answer there. What part of the nervous system have we bypassed here? We've bypassed the brain. All right, so let's talk about different types of reflex arc pathways. Some reflex arc pathways are considered monosynaptic, while others are considered polysynaptic. Mono means one. That is literally one single synapse between the sensory and the motor neuron. There are no interneurons in a monosynaptic pathway. Of course, these will be faster, right? Because you're only having to synapse between the sensory and the motor neuron. Poly means many, so this particular type of reflex is a pathway between a sensory neuron coming into the spinal cord. Of course, that's dorsal root, right? There's the interneuron that's within the spinal cord, and the motor neuron, which originates in the spinal cord and travels out that ventral root. Now, this particular pathway involves maybe one or more interneurons. So this type of reflex arc does have some speed to it, but it's not quite as fast as the monosynaptic pathway. No matter how you lay it out, whether it's mono or polysynaptic, reflex arcs are fast responses to a stimulus. So let's talk about these monosynaptic pathways first. We'll first discuss a stretch reflex and a knee-jerk reflex. This stretch reflex occurs when a muscle overstretches or begins to stretch. You'll notice that we come in through this dorsal root. We know that is sensory, right? That comes into the spinal cord. Notice we did not find an interneuron in here. We have synapsed directly here with a motor neuron. There's no discussion, there's no conversation. The sensory neuron simply tells the motor neuron what's going on. The motor neuron comes back out. This, of course, is our ventral root, and that carries motor information right back out to our effector organ. Here, our effector organ is the muscle. And so to keep the muscle from overstretching, the response is to make it contract. Do you know why it might be bad for muscle to overstretch? If it tears due to overstretching, then that muscle may in fact be damaged to the point that it cannot repair itself. We know skeletal muscle is slow to heal anyway, so if we end up having damage due to overstretching, that could cause unforeseen problems down the road. So this is a reflex that results from having a muscle stretched that promotes its contraction. Think about when you get up or you feel like you're getting ready to fall, you feel those muscles begin to pull. This kind of reflex here tries to contract those muscles and prevent them from overstretching. Another type of monosynaptic pathway is the knee-jerk reflex. Now, the knee-jerk reflex includes a monosynaptic pathway and a polysynaptic. We're going to focus only on the monosynaptic pathway. So if we strike a patellar ligament around your knee area, like you can see here, the strike or stimulus comes along from this sensory neuron here. Of course, this is in the dorsal root, and it's going to follow this pathway here. And the reason I know it's that pathway is because it's monosynaptic, meaning there's one synapse between the sensory and the motor neuron. We come right back out. We are traveling a motor pathway. This is a ventral root. And we come right back out and we tell this quadriceps muscle here to contract. And when it contracts, it causes your leg to extend. Now, there is a secondary component here. You'll notice this secondary component back here involves a polysynaptic pathway. We're not focusing on that right now. We're only focusing on what happens when you strike the patellar ligament, stimulating that ligament to cause our knees to extend or kick. Okay, so monosynaptic means one synapse, that is a single synapse between a sensory and a motor neuron that occurs inside the spinal cord. Let's talk about polysynaptic reflexes. Polysynaptic means there are multiple synapses. These are fast, but they're not quite as fast as a monosynaptic reflex. The withdrawal reflex or flexor reflex is one example. This occurs if you happen to put your hand on a hot stove. The sensory information comes in by way of the dorsal root, and then look at all this communication that goes on here inside that spinal cord. There are some interneurons there, and we come back out this ventral root with motor directions. The directions come to your arm muscles here, biceps, triceps, and we tell them to do their job so that your arm will jerk away from that source of potential damage. So the withdrawal reflex you don't even think about. This reflex does not travel through your brain. It simply routes into your spinal cord and right back out to those muscles. Now certainly you know what's gone on because we're going to hit one of these ascending tracts over here in the white matter. You might recall that's those white columns of white matter. And of course the brain knows about it a second or so later. So if you ever have burned your hand really bad, you realize that you've jerked your hand away. You know it's going to hurt, but it takes time for that pain to travel up to your brain. That's because we're traveling a spino-thalamic pathway. We know that carries pain and temperature information to your brain, and it does take about a second later for your brain to receive and process that information. But this part here, all this stuff about going to your brain, that is not part of the reflex. That is actually a separate pathway that involves taking that pain or temperature information up. The tendon reflex is also a polysynaptic pathway. If you're carrying a very heavy object, maybe a heavy box, then your muscles eventually can tire. When that muscle contracts, the response here, this reflex, is to make your muscle relax. Again, the reasoning here is because we don't want that muscle to overwork or tear. You know, the worst thing would be for this muscle here to tear away from its point of attachment to a bone. So if your muscle is unable to relax when it's being contracted, the automatic reflex is to make that muscle relax. So if you've ever carried a really heavy box and you said, oh, I'm going to drop this, it's really heavy, I'm going to drop this, you know that you're getting ready to activate that tendon reflex, which makes those muscles relax when contracted. Now, something to think about. This tendon reflex is opposite to one we just discussed. Right? It is opposite to the stretch reflex. Stretch reflex makes the muscle contract, whereas the tendon reflex makes the muscle relax. Just something good to hang on to there.